Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are opening a text that has been called, well, everything from a pre-Mosaic revelation to a Renaissance forgery.
Sure.
A single manuscript whose journey through history is almost as dramatic as its content. This isn't just, a collection of ancient writings.
No, not at all. It's really a legendary source of secret wisdom, a document that fundamentally reshaped Western philosophy, early modern science, even the very concept of human dignity.
And for centuries, this wisdom was attributed to a figure so important, so foundational, that many believed he literally wrote the oldest theology in the world.
Right, a pagan prophet who somehow anticipated the core truths of Christianity, magic, and science. The truth, though, the truth is far more complicated.
Yeah.
It was born from a profound historical mistake, actually, and that mistake is precisely why these texts mattered so much. It's kind of ironic.
Our mission today, then, is to tell the whole story of the Corpus Hermeticum. We're going to trace its mysterious kind of melting pot origins in the ancient world, unpack its core philosophy that radically elevates humanity to, well, co-creator status.
A really radical idea for the time.
Absolutely. And detail the massive historical error that rocketed it to fame. And finally, look at its surprising and essential modern reevaluation. We have sources covering what? 2 millennia of belief, misinterpretation, and intellectual revolution.
Yeah, it's quite a span. And to start, we really have to define what we're diving into. When we say the Corpus Hermeticum, we are referring to a highly specific, curated canon.
Okay.
It's a collection of 17 distinct Greek treatises. They were all composed roughly between 100 and 300 CE.
So Roman Egypt, basically.
Exactly, which places them squarely in that complex religious and intellectual period we call late antiquity.
So it's not a fixed gospel, then, or like a history book.
Yeah.
What is the fundamental structure of these treatises?
Well, their structure is really key to their purpose. They are dialogues of revelation.
Dialogues.
You, the listener, you're meant to be the disciple in this scenario. In almost every tractate, the master is the legendary figure Hermes Trismegistus.
The man himself.
Yes. And he is instructing a pupil, usually his son Tat, or sometimes the famous Egyptian physician Asclepius.
And what do they cover?
Oh, everything. The nature of the supreme god, the structure of the cosmos, right down to the practical path towards spiritual transformation, or what they called gnosis.
Gnosis, right. So it's an anthology of a spiritual movement, essentially. A collection of writings that survived, maybe by chance, and later editorial decisions.
Pretty much. And the sources do mention that this specific 17 treatise collection is just a fragment of a much, much larger body of literature, the Hermetica.
Ah, okay. So this is just the tip of the iceberg.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
Even the numbering itself is a bit of a historical quirk. The original Byzantine compilation actually skipped a slot.
Really?
Yeah, which is why we go from chapter 14th straight to 60. It just underscores that we are dealing with a survival, a selection. This is merely the core philosophical selection that made it into Latin during the Renaissance.
And the larger Hermetica? What else was in there?
Well, that includes vast amounts of material on things like astrology, alchemy, and ritual magic, stuff we'll definitely touch on later.
Got it. Okay, let's get to the figurehead himself, the legendary author, Hermes Trismegistus. Even his name. It feels like a foundational piece of philosophical engineering.
It really is. He's the ultimate product of syncretism.
Syncretism, the fusion of different beliefs.
Exactly. This figure, Hermes Trismegistus, is a Hellenistic fusion of the mighty Egyptian god Thoth,
The god of wisdom.
and the Greek god Hermes. And this wasn't just, a casual pairing. It was very intentional. A deliberate merging to create an authorial voice with unimpeachable ancient authority.
Okay, so break that down. What specific attributes did each god bring to this fusion that made the resulting figure the perfect voice for a wisdom text like this?
Okay, so Thoth, the Egyptian half, he's the ibis-headed god of wisdom, right? The divine scribe, the patron of magic, mathematics, the inventor of writing itself.
The source of knowledge.
He is the ultimate repository and source of all sacred ancient knowledge. His presence guarantees antiquity and profundity.
And Hermes, the Greek side, what does he bring?
Well, Hermes is the winged messenger, the angelos. He mediates between the gods and humans. He's the patron of speech, interpretation, communication.
Hermeneutics comes from him.
Exactly, the word hermeneutics.
Yeah.
And crucially, he is also the psychopomp.
The guide of souls.
The guide of souls to the underworld, yeah. So he connects the realms.
Okay, so when you fuse them,
Wow.
You get the perfect symbolic persona for these texts.
Yeah.
It ensures the content is divine wisdom that's Thoth,
Right.
delivered as a revelation that's Hermes, all guiding the soul's journey, which is that shared psychopomp role. That's more than just a pseudonym. It really is a philosophical engine.
Precisely. It's engineered authority. And, in some traditions, they even suggested that Hermes Trismegistus wasn't actually one writer, but a revered pseudonym used by, well, potentially thousands of authors throughout time. People who wish to attribute their work to the divine source itself rather than take personal mortal credit.
That speaks volumes about the weight this name carried.
Incredible weight. Yeah.
And the weight is literally in the name. Trismegistus, thrice greatest. Where did that epithet actually come from, and how did its meaning kind of shift over time?
Well, the linguistic origin, ironically, is pretty mundane. It's just a dry piece of translation, really.
Ah.
It's the Greek rendering of an Egyptian superlative idiom. You see, ancient Egyptian inscriptions often used repetition for intensity.
Like very, very good.
Exactly. If they wanted to say the absolute greatest, they would literally write great, great, great.
Yeah.
So the Greeks encountered this powerful repetition used to describe Thoth and, well, naturally translated it into Trismegistos. It was simply shorthand for greatest.
But history rarely leaves simple origins alone, does it? The sources show that, like a blank screen, this title became a kind of Rorschach test for later generations. They just projected their own priorities onto the thrice greatest.
Oh, absolutely. This reception history is fascinating. When the texts were brought back into prominence during the Renaissance, the Magi, the great practitioners like Pico della Mirandola or John Dee, they interpreted the title as Hermes' complete mastery over the three parts of wisdom that govern the universe: alchemy, astrology, and theurgy.
So mastery over the material, celestial, and divine realms.
For them, that's what it meant, supreme mastery.
But the Christian apologists, they had to fit this supposedly ancient prophet into their own narrative, right? Which led to a completely different interpretation.
They absolutely did. They were trying to harmonize this powerful pagan authority with the biblical timeline. So Christian interpreters viewed Hermes as the ideal ancient statesman and sage. They defined Trismegistus as meaning he was the greatest priest, philosopher, and king. He was the perfect example of human achievement before the Christian revelation arrived.
Sort of the best a pagan could be.
Kind of, yeah. And by the Byzantine era, they went even further, fully integrating him.
Fully Christianized.
Completely. There's a 10th century Byzantine encyclopedia that claimed he was called Trismegistus because he had somehow praised the Christian Trinity, saying there was one divine nature in the Trinity.
Wow. That's quite a leap.
It allowed Christian compilers to confidently claim him as a pagan prophet who had providentially foreshadowed the divine doctrine. The sheer adaptability of this figure across wildly different theological movements is just astonishing. He could literally be molded to fit any agenda that required ancient authority.
That malleability, the fact that Hermes could be anything to anyone, makes perfect sense when we look at the historical pressure cooker where the Corpus Hermeticum was actually born. Roman Egypt. Specifically Alexandria, during the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE.
Alexandria, yeah. At that time, it wasn't just a city. It was the intellectual center of the ancient world. Our sources call it a turbulent religious sea, a profound melting pot of cultures, philosophies, religions, all colliding and creating new spiritual ideas at an unprecedented rate.
Okay, let's list those competing currents. What exactly was in that cauldron? What was bubbling away there?
Okay, well, you had dominant Greek philosophy, so the highly systematic traditions of Middle Platonism and Stoicism.
Right.
That was mixing with the ancient Egyptian religious traditions, which were still very powerful. You had Jewish allegory and mysticism. And of course, nascent early Christian ideas still fighting for dominance and defining their own orthodoxy.
It sounds incredibly fertile.
Oh, it was. This intellectual ferment produced Hermeticism, Gnosticism, Neoplatonism, the Chaldean oracles, and even the raw practical magic texts known as the Greek magical papyri. It was a time of immense spiritual experimentation.
And this syncretism, that must be the reason the Hermetic texts lack uniformity, right? They aren't a single fixed dogma like a holy book. They contain internal contradictions, some wildly world-affirming, others intensely ascetic, body-rejecting.
That's the critical takeaway here. Hermeticism wasn't a church with a defined hierarchy or a single doctrine. It was a diverse milieu of religious and philosophical exploration, a kind of generalized spiritual orientation.
So the contradictions aren't errors.
No, not signs of textual corruption. They actually reflect the multifaceted religious landscape of late antiquity, where different seekers emphasize different aspects of the truth.
Okay. Now, the closest intellectual sibling born from this same soil is Gnosticism. How did these two traditions, which scholars sometimes group together as Hellenistic Gnosticism, how did they share fundamental DNA?
Well, they share a core preoccupation: the pursuit of gnosis.
That's special knowledge again.
Right. Both traditions hold that salvation is achieved not through faith, not through adherence to ritual, but through direct, unmediated, experiential, and salvific knowledge.
Well,
Knowing. And both also rely on that powerful narrative of the soul's descent from the perfect divine realm, its entrapment in limiting material form, and then its eventual ascent back to reunion with the source.
we see that narrative immediately in the first tractate, don't we? Poimandres, CHI. It recounts a creation myth that feels very familiar if you know Gnostic texts or Jewish allegorical readings of Genesis, the fall of a primordial divine man into matter.
The textual parallels are certainly striking, but the most decisive proof that Hermeticism and Gnosticism were considered part of the same intellectual family comes not just from literary analysis, but from archaeology.
The physical evidence.
Exactly. The 1945 discovery of the Nag Hammadi Library in Egypt.
This is the definitive aha moment, right? The one that changed scholarship on this period forever.
Yeah.
Tell us what they found in that jar.
Okay, so in Upper Egypt, a collection of 52 treatises was found hidden in a big storage jar. Most of them were Gnostic Christian texts works that had been condemned by the burgeoning Christian orthodoxy.
Right, the heretical stuff.
Exactly. But what was so revelatory for our study, for Hermeticism, is that buried alongside those Gnostic Christian texts were 3 Hermetic works:
No way, which ones?
the Discourse on the 8th and Ninth, the Prayer of Thanksgiving, and a Coptic fragment of the Asclepius.
Wait, so the same people? The same intellectual monastic elite who were using and preserving these heretical Gnostic Christian texts?
Yeah.
They felt that the Hermetic texts belonged right there with them, in the same jar.
It's irrefutable physical proof. It
Yeah.
shows that in the 4th century, the communities that were labeled heretical or heterodox, those who sought what we sometimes call rejected knowledge, they saw the Hermetic works as belonging to their own canon. They
Wow.
were all considered part of a single, continuous corpus of non-orthodox wisdom. It really validates the scholarly view that these traditions grew from the exact same turbulent soil.
Okay, so shared soil, shared focus on gnosis. Yet despite this, there's a profound philosophical chasm between Gnosticism and Hermeticism. And this is the key distinction, right, for understanding their later historical applications.
It absolutely is.
It boils down to a single question. Is the material world good or evil?
This is the great divide. The difference between pessimism and optimism, fundamentally. Gnosticism is characterized by, well, anti-cosmic world rejection. Meaning the material cosmos is viewed as a prison, an aberration, created by a flawed or ignorant lesser god, the demiurge. Matter itself is inherently negative, a trap, and salvation is fundamentally an escape from matter and the material body.
So if the world's a mistake, the only pious act is to reject it, to get out. Hermeticism, though, it embraces the material world, doesn't it?
That's right. Hermeticism is generally optimistic and panentheistic. The cosmos isn't a prison, but a sacred, beautiful creation. It's often called a second god, the very image of the mightier one.
And the creator.
The creator, the divine mind, or nous, is perfect. Salvation, therefore, is an escape. It's illumination, seeing the divine hidden within the material form and achieving reintegration with the cosmos.
So Gnosticism preaches flight, Hermeticism preaches engagement. And that difference, that has enormous practical implications down the line.
It's the theological justification for everything technical and magical in Hermeticism, because the Hermetic worldview says the world is fundamentally good and a reflection of God, that famous as above, so below axiom.
Right.
It becomes a logical and even pious act to engage with the world in sophisticated ways. That's why Hermeticism gave rise to systems like astrology, which reads the divine order in the stars.
Makes sense.
Alchemy, which aims to perfect material reality, return it to its divine form, and theurgy, which actively draws down divine powers. For a Gnostic, doing any of those things would just deepen their imprisonment in a flawed cosmos. It wouldn't make any sense.
Let's talk about the specific philosophical debt the Hermetic writers incurred, because the texts are just saturated with contemporary Greek philosophy, Middle Platonism and Stoicism especially.
Oh yeah, the authors were clearly highly educated in the intellectual currents of the time. They borrowed, adapted, repurposed concepts like nous, mind, logos, word or reason, and demiurge, the craftsman. The Hermetica sits right in that syncretic, intellectually dynamic Middle Platonic period, existing before Neoplatonism was fully systematized by Plotinus later on.
We introduced the term nous earlier, but we need to slow down here and make a really critical distinction because the Hermetic use of nous is, well, it's unique and pretty radical compared to the philosophical use.
This is a crucial pivot point, yes. If we look at Neoplatonism, the system developed by Plotinus.
The big figure in Neoplatonism.
Right. For him, nous is fundamentally a metaphysical level or a hypostasis.
Okay, define hypostasis for us. That sounds technical.
Think of it as a fixed, fundamental principle or level of reality in the cosmos. For Plotinus, reality emanates downwards from the ultimate source, the One. The very first emanation is the level of mind, or nous. This is the realm of perfect Platonic forms, eternal and unchanging ideas.
So it's a cosmic layer.
It's structural, static, abstract. As a philosopher, you study or contemplate the nous.
But in Hermeticism, nous isn't structural like that. It's entirely experiential, isn't it?
Yeah.
Salvific.
Exactly. For Hermes, nous is a gift. It's a transformation, an experiential faculty directly related to salvation or soteriology. It's described as a kind of radical state of consciousness expansion that a human receives through divine grace.
So you don't just think about it.
No, it's not something you contemplate abstractly. It's something you receive and, in a sense, become. There's a tractate, The Crater, CHIV, that dramatically describes God filling a mixing bowl, a crater, with nous and inviting those with a pure heart to come and baptize themselves in it.
Wow.
The initiate doesn't just contemplate mind, they receive or become divine mind itself. This really cements Hermeticism as an initiatory path of inner transformation, not just a rationalist school of philosophy.
And we know Plotinus, the founder of Neoplatonism, he was aware of this whole intellectual milieu, right? He was a contemporary and apparently a fierce critic.
Oh, scathing. Particularly in his treatise against the Gnostics. His polemic was aimed squarely at their anti-cosmic dualism and pessimism.
Why? What bothered him so much?
He felt they were incredibly arrogant for rejecting the beauty and inherent goodness of the material creation, which he saw as a perfect, rational, and beautiful emanation of the One. Plotinus was deeply concerned with the fundamental goodness of the cosmos.
But this critique actually helps us understand the sheer diversity within Hermeticism too, doesn't it?
It does. Plotinus's attack is perfectly valid against the pessimistic, world-rejecting strains within the corpus itself, like that tractate that demands the disciple hate thy body.
Right.
But Plotinus himself would likely have found common ground with the optimistic strains, like the Asclepius, which celebrates the cosmos as a second god and a divine masterpiece. The Hermetic corpus was a broad spiritual spectrum, capturing the entire intellectual complexity of Alexandria. That's why it was so adaptable later on.
Okay. Having set the stage, let's get to the core philosophical concepts that truly define the Corpus Hermeticum, the ideas that really captured the Renaissance mind later. At the heart of their theology is this sophisticated dual conception of God, described as both the one and the all.
Yes, this is pure panentheism, and we need to be careful to distinguish that from simple pantheism.
Okay, what's the difference?
Pantheism says God is everything, identical to the universe. Panentheism, however, says God is in everything, but also greater than everything, transcendent and immanent.
So how does Hermeticism articulate this both-hand idea?
Well, on one hand, God is the ultimate, transcendent, unknowable source, referred to as the One or the monad.
Like the Neoplatonists.
Very much so. He's the Father, the first principle, invisible, immeasurable, indivisible, existing entirely outside of creation.
Okay, that sounds like a fairly standard transcendent God concept. You might find it in Platonism or even Jewish or Christian thought.
It does, yes. But simultaneously, God is the immanent totality of all existence, the all, or to pan in Greek. This leads to the central paradoxical maxim we find running throughout the texts. God is both the creator and the creation.
He creates and is the creation.
Yes, he is creating all things he creates himself. He's described as invisible and entirely visible.
That phrase, creating all things he creates himself, that's incredibly potent. It suggests the act of creation isn't like building something external. It's more internal, maybe spiritual.
Exactly. The process of creation is an outpouring of divine will or logos word or reason that occurs within God's own essence. He doesn't make a world external to himself. He reveals himself through the world.
So the world is God made visible.
In a sense, yes. He is invisible in his ultimate essence, but he makes himself visible and knowable through the structure and beauty of his creation. This fundamentally positive view of the physical world is the engine driving Hermeticism.
And this theology absolutely underpins their entire cosmology, doesn't it? Their view of the universe as a living, divine, hierarchical image of God's perfect mind.
Precisely. The cosmos is presented as a divine masterpiece, an orderly and beautiful, mighty God, an image of the mightier one. This establishes a clear hierarchy of divine reflection. As the texts state, God creates eternity, eternity creates the cosmos creates time, and time creates generation, meaning all living things.
So everything below reflects the order above.
Exactly. Which naturally brings us to the most famous maxim associated with the Hermetica, the theoretical basis for all the technical practices. As above, so below.
Now, you mentioned this is technically from the Emerald Tablet, not the corpus itself.
That's right. It's from a separate, primarily alchemical text. But it is the functional cornerstone of Hermetic thought. It's not just a poetic aphorism. It's the theoretical assertion that the microcosm man, the below, and the macrocosm, the heavens, the above, are fundamentally interconnected. They're parts of a single, unified, sympathetic, living organism.
So if the heavens, the macrocosm, are orderly, divine, predictable, then everything on Earth must be susceptible to that same order and influence. Is that the idea?
That's the entire mechanical basis for those three parts of wisdom we mentioned earlier: alchemy, astrology, theurgy. This principle justifies them all.
How so? Spell it out.
Okay. 1. Astrology. We can read the fate or nature of the below us, events on Earth, in the movements of the above, the planets and stars.
Okay.
2. Alchemy. By perfecting matter, the below, we are actually participating in the cosmic process of illumination, helping return the world to its divine form.
Right.
And 3. Theurgy. We can use cosmic knowledge, knowing the sympathies, the connections, to create channels that draw the powers of the above down into the below for spiritual or even material effect.
Okay, that clarifies the practical link. Now let's move to humanity itself, because Hermetic anthropology is, well, it's revolutionary, especially when you think about the 15th century when it was rediscovered. It's encapsulated in that incredible declaration from the Asclepius, what a great miracle is man.
Magnum miraculum est homo, yes. This is arguably the single most influential phrase in the entire corpus. And the miracle lies in man's radical paradox. He occupies two realms simultaneously.
How so?
He has a mortal body, linking him to the lower world of generation and decay, but he also has an immortal soul, spirit, and crucially, nous, which links him directly to God and the divine realm.
Man is the nexus, the connection point. The microcosm reflecting the macrocosm, which reflects God.
Exactly. And that unique status gives humanity godlike potential. Unlike any other creature, man is the only creature who knows the supreme God. And the most radical philosophical claim here is that through this knowledge and transformation, man can even in this life become a god.
Become a god. That's strong language.
The Asclepius states it boldly. Man changes his nature into a god's, as if he were God.
To understand the impact of that, we really have to think back to the prevailing view in the medieval period, right? The dominant Christian theology emphasized man's lowly station, the fall from grace, original sin, the need for salvation purely through grace from above.
Exactly. Medieval thinking was deeply structured around man's fallen nature. So, when the Corpus Hermeticum arrived in Florence in the 15th century, claiming to be older than Moses, this exaltation of man provided nascent Renaissance humanism with the divine authority it desperately needed.
Ah, so they could point to this ancient text.
Yes. They could now argue, using a text they believe predated the Bible, that humanity's essence wasn't original sin, but divine potential. It gave them a spiritual and intellectual license to celebrate human dignity, creativity, and potential in a way that radically challenged the medieval status quo.
Okay, so if man has this incredible godlike potential, how does he actually realize it? The philosophical goal is gnosis, right? Achieved through a transformation the Hermetists called palingenesia.
Palingenesia, yeah, or rebirth.
When you reiterate, this isn't just intellectual understanding, it's direct, unmediated existential knowing.
A total transformation. A total transformation of the self, where self-knowledge is the absolute key. The commandment is essentially simple. Understand yourself, know thyself, and you unlock the universe and the divine within you.
But, as we noted earlier, the tractates seem to present two wildly contradictory methods for achieving this rebirth. It makes the tradition seem almost bipolar. Let's start with the ascetic path, the path of world rejection.
Right. This is clearly the purification stage. We find this philosophy most intensely in tractates like The Creator, ch4, and The Secret Sermon on the Mountain, ch13. It advocates transcendence, detachment, intense purification.
And that quote you mentioned.
The quote from The Creator is really arresting. "Unless thou first shall hate thy body, son, thou canst not love thyself."
Wow. Hate the body.
Yeah. Incarnation is framed almost as a trap, and the goal is a battle against the 12 tormentors, vices linked metaphorically to the zodiac that dominate the unpurified soul.
Okay, that sounds almost Gnostic again. Flight from the body, rejection of the material. But then you have the complete opposite, the co-creator path, most clearly found in the Asclepius.
This is the high water mark of Hermetic optimism. The co-creator path is utterly world-affirming. It views man not as a victim trapped in matter, but as a divine craftsman and co-creator, whose sacred role is to administrate the material world and align it with the divine order. The goal is illumination within the world, not flight from it.
How then do modern scholars resolve this apparent philosophical schizophrenia? How can one tradition preach both hate the body and co-create the world? It seems impossible.
Well, the scholarly consensus now is that they likely represent two sequential stages of a single, complete initiatory path.
Stages. Okay.
Stage 1 has to be the ascetic path, purification. You must detox the soul, fight those tormentors, shed the ego.
Okay.
Basically, make yourself a clean vessel capable of receiving news.
So you empty the vessel first, get rid of the bad stuff.
Exactly. Only after receiving news and achieving that state of purification can you transition to stage 2, the co-creator path. The purified soul is now equipped. It's a divine craftsman capable of using cosmic knowledge to actively spiritualize this material world.
So you have to reach heaven first, metaphorically, before you can begin the work of bringing heaven down to earth.
That's a good way to put it, yes.
That synthesized view. It makes the most shocking claim of the Asclepius, that doctrine of man creates gods, finally makes some kind of sense. This is the practice of the Irgi, right?
This is the technical apex of that world-affirming path. Hermes tells Asclepius quite directly that man, this mortal, earthly, living creature, also himself creates gods.
Creates gods. How did Asclepius react?
Well, Asclepius is initially baffled. He thinks Hermes just means carving idols, statues, but Hermes firmly corrects him. No, he's talking about the theurgic art, the science of divine works.
Okay, we need to define the theurgic art very clearly here. It's not just prayer, right? Or trying to compel a god with magic.
No, theurgy in the Hermetic sense means divine collaboration. Man uses his cosmic knowledge, astrology, knowledge of specific material properties, maybe special vocalizations, to consecrate physical objects.
Consecrate them how?
By drawing down specific divine powers or spirits from the heavens and essentially infusing them into matter. The result is meant to be a living, ensouled object.
So these man-made gods were objects that were believed to possess an active, localized divine power, like a battery of divine energy.
Sort of, yeah. Hermes claims these created beings have soul and breath. They can give prophecies, and they can even give men sickness and healing. This is the ultimate expression of the Hermetic view of man's godlike potential. Not just knowing God, but actively collaborating with God to spiritualize matter and create localized divine presences right here on Earth.
This focus on traditional divine order, on Egypt as the center, it leads directly to one of the most mournful and famous passages in the entire Hermetica, the Lament of Egypt. A dark prophecy.
Yes, the Asclepius contains this long, quite moving lament where Hermes warns of a future age. He mourns that Egypt, the land he calls the very image of heaven, will be widowed of its gods. Yeah. Its sacred wisdom will be abandoned, its temples will become full of tombs, and the pious man who upholds the traditional rites, he'll be counted as insane.
That's a powerful emotional elegy. But scholars widely agree this is probably an ex eventu prophecy, right?
It's crucial to understand that term, yes. Ex eventu means written after the fact. The text pretends to be a prediction written in the deep past, but it was actually written much later, reacting to contemporary events.
So what events were they reacting to?
This lament is widely interpreted as a pagan elegy, a profound reaction to the aggressive rise of Christianity and the violent prohibition of traditional pagan worship. It was possibly composed after major events like the destruction of huge temples, like the Serapeum in Alexandria around 301 CE. It's a historical document capturing the despair of the old faith as it saw itself being eclipsed.
Now, you mentioned earlier that the philosophical texts describe gnosis as the goal, but the actual ritual praxis, the how-to, was largely missing from the Greek philosophical corpus. The Coptic texts from Nag Hammadi filled in that gap, didn't they?
They provided the explosive missing link, absolutely. The discovery of texts like the Discourse on the 8th and 9th confirmed, without doubt, that Hermeticism was an explicitly practical initiatory path. This Coptic tractate actually details an initiation rite.
What does it describe?
It guides the disciple through an ecstatic, silent vision of the heavenly spheres, the 8th and the 9th, culminating in the achievement of rebirth, that palingenesia.
And this wasn't just contemplation, it involved actual physical instruction, liturgy.
It was praxis. The key of revelation was the presence of explicit instructions involving a series of ritual vowel phrases or vocalizations.
Like chanting.
Exactly. The text literally records these chants, sometimes arranged in triangular patterns on the page, like A-O-E-E, O-E-E, Oo-3. These were highly specific, probably secret meditational mantras used to invoke divine power and facilitate the soul's ascent through the spheres.
So people have called this the AUM of the West.
That's what some scholars have called it, yeah. And this discovery definitively proves that the high philosophy of the corpus and the practical, ecstatic, potentially magical initiation were two necessary halves of the single way of Hermes. The mind and the body, the theory and the practice, they were meant to be unified.
Okay, so this incredible spiritual program, with its radical optimism and promise of human divinity, it was virtually unknown in the Latin West throughout the Middle Ages. But its rediscovery in 1463 in Florence, that didn't just change philosophy, it seems like it fundamentally rebooted the direction of Western civilization.
It's truly one of the greatest, most dramatic anecdotes in intellectual history. You have to picture the scene. It's 1460 Florence. The great Medici patron, Cosimo de' Medici, is financing this huge revival of classical thought.
The Renaissance is kicking off.
Exactly. And a Greek manuscript containing the Corpus Hermeticum arrives from Macedonia. Cosimo, an extremely wealthy and powerful man, gets his hands on this text, which he believes contains the most ancient wisdom in the world, older than anything else.
And at the time, Marsilio Ficino, the young head of Cosimo's Florentine Academy, he was dedicating his entire life to translating Plato, right? A huge task.
Monumental. And Cosimo stops him dead in his tracks. This is the moment. Cosimo commands Ficino to stop translating Plato immediately and translate these Hermetic texts first.
Wow. Plato takes a back seat.
The urgency was overwhelming. Ficino complied, naturally. He translated the first 14 treatises and published them in 1471 under the Latin title Pomander.
And the reason for this immense urgency, this global paradigm shift, it rests entirely on a monumental, fundamental historical mistake.
The greatest, most productive mistake in the history of ideas, perhaps. Ficino and his contemporaries genuinely believed, based on the internal claims of the text and some Christian apocryphal traditions, that Hermes Trismegistus was a real historical figure, a sage who lived before Moses.
Before Moses.
Yes. They thought the texts were ancient Egyptian wisdom translated into Greek, and thus contained the oldest, purest theology in the world.
This error gave birth to that powerful concept of Prisca Theologia, ancient theology.
Define the Renaissance mindset completely. Prisca Theologia was the belief in a single, true, pure wisdom passed down through a golden chain of primordial sages.
A lineage of wisdom.
Exactly. Hermes was considered the first and purest source. Then came Zoroaster, Orpheus, Pythagoras, and finally, Plato. Since Hermes supposedly predated biblical figures like Moses, his writings became the ultimate philosophical fountainhead.
And this was crucial because it provided the theological license Renaissance humanists needed to synthesize pagan philosophy with Christianity without being accused of heresy.
It made their whole project safe, intellectually and theologically. If Hermes wrote before Christ, his philosophy wasn't heretical. It was prophetic. It was simply the earliest form of the truth, waiting for Christian fulfillment. This chronological error provided the sacred foundation for that radical exaltation of man that defined the Renaissance and spurred its explosive creativity.
We should probably mention the other key translator here, Lodovico Lazzarelli. His experience seems quite different from Ficino's more scholarly pursuit.
Lazzarelli provides a crucial corrective to the popular narrative, yes. He translated the final 3 treatises that Ficino lacked. But while Ficino treated the texts primarily as philosophy, Lazzarelli experienced them as a profound, life-changing religious conversion.
Really? How so?
He fully embraced the ecstatic initiatory side. He actually became a disciple of a rather eccentric figure, a self-proclaimed Hermetic Christ named Giovanni Mercurio da Correggio.
So, Lazzarelli was the true inheritor of the ancient ecstatic spirit, maybe, while Ficino was the scholarly intellectualizer.
That's a good way to see it. Ficino's more intellectual, scholarly, and safely Neoplatonic reading won out in the mainstream, partly because it appealed more to the Florentine elite. Lazzarelli's radical, prophetic focus on the crater and ecstatic rebirth, it failed to spread as widely, but his interpretation was arguably far more faithful to the original initiatory intent of the ancient texts.
But Ficino's intellectualization, even if it was watering down, it provided the cover for the Hermetic Magi who followed, right, like Pico della Mirandola. How did the corpus specifically influence Pico?
Pico was the ultimate syncretist, and Hermes was his blueprint. In his famous oration on the dignity of man, Pico directly celebrates the Hermetic idea of man as a co-creator, free to ascend or descend the cosmic chain. He used Prisca Theologia to justify harmonizing virtually every philosophy and religion he could find: Platonism, Christian Kabbalah, Hermeticism into one universal, unified truth. Hermes was the essential ancient key that unlocked it all for him.
And the influence on Giordano Bruno was so deep and radical, it arguably led directly to his execution in 1600.
Bruno fully embraced the intense magical religion he found in the Asclepius. He believed completely in its vision of an animate, divine, and infinite cosmos, where man was a divine operator capable of great things.
And Francis Yates argued he was burned for that, not just for supporting Copernicus.
Yates famously argued that he wasn't executed primarily for upholding Copernicanism, but for his zealous espousal of this hermetic magical religion, which the Church found deeply threatening. He viewed his complex art of memory as a kind of theurgic, magical ascent designed to attain a divine perspective on the infinite universe he believed Hermes described.
Then you have someone like John Dee, Queen Elizabeth I's advisor, trying to recapture this pure wisdom through mathematics and, well, angelic communication.
Dee was pious, certainly, but his piety was saturated with Hermetic and Pythagorean thought. He was inspired by the text's claim of man's godlike powers and their emphasis on cosmic order. Dee believed that mathematics was the pure language of the cosmos, the key that could unlock the divine potential lost by Adam in the garden. His life's work, including his controversial attempts at angelic communication, was essentially a rigorous, practical application of the ancient theology he believed he read in the corpus.
So for over 150 years, the authority of the corpus was basically sacrosanct. It was the foundation of the Renaissance mind. And then, in 1614, comes the hammer blow, the famous philological collapse led by Isaac Casaubon.
This is the intellectual watershed moment. It fundamentally separates the Renaissance mind from the beginning of the Age of Reason. Casaubon was a brilliant classical scholar, commissioned by King James I of England, a king who was deeply paranoid about occultism and witchcraft, to provide an unassailable critique of these magical texts that were gaining, perhaps, too much influence.
And his method was devastatingly simple.
Devastatingly simple, yet revolutionary for the time. He applied early modern philology, the science of determining the age and origin of texts based purely on their language.
And what did Casaubon's meticulous linguistic analysis reveal? What was the smoking gun?
He proved definitively beyond any doubt that the texts could not have been written by a contemporary of Moses. They were not ancient Egyptian translations.
How did you know?
Linguistically, they were written in sophisticated Koine Greek, the common Greek of the Roman Empire. And doctrinally, they were full of the technical philosophical vocabulary of Platonism and Stoicism systems that simply did not exist until the first millennium BCE, at least 1,000 years after Moses was supposed to have lived.
So Casaubon proved that the texts were simply highly polished syncretic philosophy from the 2nd and 3rd century CE, from that Alexandria melting pot we discussed.
Exactly.
The central pillar of Prisca Theologia. It just shattered instantly.
The effect was catastrophic for the text's authority. The Corpus Hermeticum was instantly demoted. It went from being primordial prophetic revelation to being labeled a spurious forgery, a bogus text written by late unknown authors. This single debunking led directly to the intellectual marginalization of Western Hermeticism. It pushed it out of mainstream philosophy, science, and theology, and relegated it firmly into the occult fringe for centuries.
The stunning irony of the entire story is that Casaubon was entirely correct philologically. His analysis was spot on, yet his correction completely killed the text's perceived religious and philosophical authority.
It's the ultimate successful failure, isn't it? His hostile but brilliant contextualization destroyed the text's prestige, even though modern scholars now value the corpus precisely because it is an authentic, invaluable snapshot of that syncretic Roman-Egyptian world that Casaubon himself probably despised.
Okay, so after being confined to the dusty corners of occult libraries for, 300 years, the Corpus Hermeticum finally returned to the academic mainstream in the 20th century. And this reevaluation was really kickstarted by Frances Yates's work in 1964.
The Yates thesis, yeah. Outlined in her book Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition, it completely transformed how we view the Renaissance. Before Yates, mainstream history largely ignored or dismissed Renaissance magic as just a minor curiosity, maybe embarrassing superstition.
But Yates argued it was central.
She argued that Hermetic magic and its associated occult interests were not marginal elements at all, but were central to the intellectual development of the era.
She reframed Renaissance magic as a legitimate, driving intellectual force, not just hocus pocus.
Absolutely. She proposed that the Hermetic magical worldview, with its radical exaltation of man as a divine operator and its belief in a mathematically ordered living cosmos, that this worldview provided the intellectual impetus and the habits of inquiry that actually helped seed early modern science.
So magic helped birth science.
She argued that the search for the divine truth in nature, justified by Hermes, was crucial for the transition from the medieval mindset to the modern scientific one. It encouraged observation and manipulation of the world.
Following Yates, the scholar Garth Fowden challenged the very notion that the tradition could be cleanly divided into high and low forms.
Right. Fowden's seminal work, The Egyptian Hermes, directly confronted the modern scholarly tendency to separate the sophisticated philosophical Hermetica, like our corpus, from the low technical practical Hermetica, like magical spells and astrological rites. He argued this division is artificial. It's something we impose looking back. It wasn't how the ancient practitioners saw it.
What was the ancient perspective then, according to Fowden?
He argued there were two aspects of a single way of Hermes for the ancient initiate. The path maybe began with technical knowledge of the cosmos and the stars, astrology, magic, moved through the philosophical knowledge of the self, the corpus, and culminated in the ecstatic knowledge of God, all integrated into one complete spiritual program.
And the Nag Hammadi evidence supports that.
Strongly supports it, showing the same communities were using both types of texts.
And more recently, Wouter Hanegraaff offered a crucial revision, arguing that the highly influential Renaissance Hermeticism we associate with Ficino was actually founded on a fundamental philosophical misunderstanding, or maybe a mistranslation.
Hanegraaff introduces a really necessary nuance here. He argues that Ficino, looking at the text through his own Christian and Neoplatonic lens, fundamentally defanged the ecstatic experiential core of the Hermetic message.
He fanged it how?
Ficino consistently translated the radical salvific gnosis as mere cognitio, which is just bland intellectual knowledge in Latin.
So he essentially sterilized a religious experience and turned it into an academic pursuit. Made it safe.
Exactly. He intellectualized the radical mystic experience to make it palatable and safe for the Florentine Academy and, importantly, for the Church. He focused on contemplation rather than initiatory rebirth. Hanegraaff contends that the other translator, the radical mystic Ludovico Lazzarelli,
The one who had the conversion experience.
right, the translator who felt the texts were a prophetic conversion. He was the true inheritor of the ancient ecstatic spirit, not the academic Ficino whose version became famous.
That suggests that the Hermeticism that actually defined the Renaissance was, in essence, an intellectualized, maybe even deliberate misreading of a much wilder, practical, and ecstatic tradition.
A safer, domesticated reading, perhaps. One that allowed the philosophy to survive mainstream scrutiny, a brilliant cultural compromise, in a way.
Finally, let's consider Jan Assmann's powerful reframing. He seems to bypass the question of truth entirely and focuses instead on cultural memory.
Assmann argues that the Hermetic tradition functions as a mnemohistory, kind of persistent counter-memory within Western civilization.
A counter-memory.
He claims the West's centuries-long obsession with Hermes wasn't really about verifying an ancient text's authenticity. It was more of a psychological mechanism, a way of remembering Egypt, or rather, using the fantasy of ancient Egyptian wisdom to critique, supplement, or maybe reconcile its own dominant traditions, whether they be Christian or purely philosophical.
So the corpus's true significance lies not necessarily in its specific content, but in the fact that powerful Western thinkers believed it was the pure, ancient truth, and then used that belief as a tool to advance radical, human-centric philosophies that they couldn't otherwise justify within their own frameworks.
It becomes a record of our culture's continuous need for a pagan, or perhaps non-monotheistic root, a kind of repository for the powerful, complex, maybe slightly dangerous, rejected knowledge that the West continuously obsesses over, revisits, and reinterprets.
Okay. Before we move to our final thoughts, we absolutely must address a common point of confusion for the listener. The Hermetic literary family is massive, right? And many texts that claim the label, well, they aren't actually related to the original Corpus Hermeticum. We need some clear lines of demarcation.
Yes, it's vital to categorize these texts for clarity. The core ancient philosophical texts that we've been discussing, those that contain the panentheism, the gnosis, the ascent narrative, that's the Corpus Hermeticum, the 17 Greek treatises, and its sister text, the Asclepius, which survived predominantly in Latin and some Coptic fragments. Those are the heart of it.
Okay. Then you have the ancient technical texts from the same Alexandrian milieu that embody the practical praxis side. The most famous is the Emerald Tablet, which people often mistakenly assume is part of the corpus.
Right. The Emerald Tablet is really the foundational alchemical axiom. It is physically separate from the corpus, but its famous maxim, as above, so below, provides the necessary theoretical underpinning for the Hermetic cosmology and justifies the whole practice of alchemy. It survived primarily through Arabic sources and represents the technical, maybe chemical side of the ancient tradition.
And the raw material of technical magic from the same period that's found in the Greek magical papyri, the PGM.
Exactly. The PGM are collections of actual spells, rituals, recipes, often invoking Hermes and Thoth by name, dating from the same cultural environment as the corpus. Fowden argues these represent the low operational magic that was the practical half of the spiritual path defined by the high philosophical corpus. The philosophy taught why it worked, the PGM showed how to actually do it.
And finally, we have to address the most common and persistent modern misattribution, the Kybalion. People see Hermetic and assume it's ancient.
The Kybalion is a fascinating case of, well, cultural appropriation, you could say. But it is unequivocally not an ancient text. It was published anonymously in the United States in 1908 by authors calling themselves the Three Initiates.
So 20th century.
Definitely 20th century. It is a foundational text of the New Thought movement and mentalism, very influential in certain modern esoteric circles.
What's the fundamental difference between the philosophy of the Kybalion and the ancient corpus? Why isn't it the same tradition?
The core difference is the philosophical goal. The ancient Corpus Hermeticum is ultimately concerned with gnosis spiritual rebirth, achieving union with the perfect transcendent God. It's soteriological. The Kybalion, on the other hand, is primarily concerned with mental mastery, manifesting reality through thought, controlling the mind.
More psychological, maybe.
Or metaphysical in a different way. Its famous 7 principles, things like mentalism, correspondence, vibration, polarity, rhythm, cause and effect, and gender, these are rooted firmly in 19th century metaphysical thought and are simply nowhere to be found in the original 17 treatises of the Corpus Hermeticum. It borrowed the prestigious name, but created a wholly modern doctrine focused on the power of the individual mind over matter.
Okay, that's a crucial distinction. So wrapping this all up, we've traversed 2 millennia of history, from the melting pot of Alexandria to the revolutionary court of Cosimo de' Medici and through the devastating critique of Casaubon. The history of the Corpus Hermeticum is this powerful, profound paradox, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It was a failed text, in a sense, written 1,000 years later than its authors claimed. Yet it became profoundly successful because its authority was founded entirely on that chronological mistake. The Prisca Theologia.
That noble lie, if you want to call it that, gave Renaissance humanists the theological permission slip they needed to experiment with radical, man-centric philosophy, theurgical magic, and a cosmology that celebrated the living, divine universe. It really helped redefine what it meant to be human in the West.
That myth shattered in 1614, yes. But its true value, as modern scholars now confirm, lies in its identity as an authentic, invaluable snapshot of the sheer religious and cultural complexity of late antiquity.
It remains probably the most complete record we have of a unique non-Christian Gnosticism that dared to see the cosmos not as a polluted prison like other Gnostics, but as a sacred image of God. A tradition that somehow contained both world-rejecting purification and world-affirming, even God-making theurgy. The history of the Corpus Hermeticum is really a history of its own rebirths, continually reappearing whenever intellectual authority is questioned or found wanting.
And the enduring myth of Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice greatest, it remains potent today, doesn't it? A timeless symbol, a repository for the rejected knowledge of every age, demonstrating that continuous human quest for self-knowledge as the path to divinity.
And that raises our final provocative thought for you, the listener. If the legend of Hermes Trismegistus is, in some ways, an empty vessel, a projection screen for what we desperately wish to be the ancient pure truth, what knowledge are we projecting onto the thrice greatest today? What powerful, maybe world-changing truths are we, in our own time of intellectual ferment and uncertainty, willing to believe, even if they might secretly rest on a beautiful, productive mistake?